Galveston, Texas, in the year 1900, was one of the fastest booming cities in America. It was a prosperous port city, which had a future in becoming the greatest city in the South, or in other words, the New York of the Gulf. Unfortunately, though, all of the city's hopes and dreams were shattered in one day, and on that day was the hurricane of 1900. Galveston is an island off of the coast of Texas. It is about 30 miles long and 1.5 to 3 miles wide. The highest point on the island was only 8 feet above sea level. The city of Galveston was located on the east end of the island. At the time of the hurricane, Galveston was home to 37,789 people, and everything is about to change. It's September 7th, 1900. It's a normal summer Friday, hot, muggy, and dry. But Galveston has been put under a storm warning by the Central Office of the Weather Bureau, now the National Weather Service. The head of the National Weather Bureau office in Galveston is Isaac Klein. At this time of year, storms are common, so Klein is not worried. Klein, about a decade ago, wrote an article on the weather at Galveston and stated that a hurricane occurring there was an absurd delusion. It will soon be proved how naive Klein had been. But the residents of Galveston trust their weather office and think no more about the situation. Earlier that week, the storm hit Cuba. Americans still controlled Cuba at this time as a result of the Spanish-American War. The Cubans living there, who were experts on the subject of hurricanes, knew that the storm would head into the Gulf of Mexico and then develop into a hurricane, since the waters were still so warm from earlier that summer. But their prediction never made it to America, much less Galveston, because of Willis Moore. Willis Moore at that time was the head of the National Weather Bureau and had declared that no Cuban weather predictions were to be sent to America, and that only Americans in Cuba could send weather reports. The Americans in Cuba said that the storm would head east to Florida and then travel up the side of the east coast. But the Americans were wrong. The storm did indeed travel northeast towards the Florida Keys, but unpredictably it then changed course and was heading straight towards Galveston, strengthening with every mile it gained. The storm had transformed into a monster. Isaac Klein, on the morning of September 7th, goes down to the beach and makes his daily observations. He notices that the tide has risen, swells are appearing, and the wind is coming from the north, which he concludes is very unusual. But still, he does not possibly believe that a hurricane is on its way. He himself wrote a document that stated that a hurricane in Galveston was absurd, and he believed it. But that was his downfall. Filled with overconfidence and stubbornness, he failed to see the signs. But there was another man on Galveston Island who thought differently. This man saw the signs, and he began to worry. Skeptical of Isaac Klein's conclusion, Joseph Klein rushed to his brother's bedroom at 4 in the morning, and pleaded with his brother to see reason about the storm. Isaac Klein dismissed his brother's warning and went back to bed. After the storm, the brothers barely ever spoke to each other again. If Isaac Klein had listened to his younger brother, the legend of the hurricane and the city of Galveston would be very different than what it is today. On the windy morning of September 8th, Isaac Klein returns to the beach and notices once again the high swells. He knows that this kind of weather is unusual, but he doesn't know what it means. By mid-morning, it starts to rain, and he heads to work, where he finds that his barometer has fallen 1/10 of an inch. The high tide does not bother the people of Galveston because they assume that it is an overflow, which is when high water sweeps the beach fronts. They happen frequently, so no one is concerned, except for Joseph Klein. All day, Joseph insists to his brother that something is not right, but Isaac waves off his warnings, for he is certain that no storm could harm the city of Galveston. But unfortunately, Isaac was way off. At 9 in the morning, the storm is 50 miles from the shore and has become a Category 4 hurricane. Ships in the Gulf that encounter the hurricane have no way of communicating with the people on shore. Galveston is on their own. The citizens go about on their normal Saturday routines while they play in the rain, completely unaware that in less than 24 hours, about 1/6 of the population would be dead. Around 12 o'clock that day, That's when the joyful atmosphere of the city shifts to seriousness. The winds exceed 40 to 50 miles per hour, and the water from the ocean begins to flood onto the streets. At 12:30, the street carts are not able to move, and the bathhouses, which sit on stilts in the ocean, collapse. Fear begins to spread like wildfire, for the hurricane has arrived. At 2:30 in the afternoon, water is rapidly filling up the city, and finally Isaac Klein realizes that his brother had been correct. This storm was more powerful than he had ever imagined. They send a telegram to Washington, and the hurricane flag is raised. But it's much too late. Trains could no longer reach the island, and water was too deep for horses and wagons. The people were trapped. The wind begins to pick up speed as many Galveston citizens leave their own homes and travel to homes that are sturdier and larger, for they think that the larger the house, the harder for it is to be destroyed. Over 50 people journeyed to the Kleins' home and many other homes across the city. The Elford family, which consisted of Milton Elford, his mother, his father, and his little nephew, traveled to a neighbor's house, but soon after even that house collapses. Milton is the only one in his family to survive. As the day progresses, the winds get up to 140 miles per hour, and the water continues to rise. Families sit huddled together in their homes, trembling with fear. There is no power, there is no communication, and the bridges have collapsed. Galveston is completely and entirely alone. At 5:30, Joseph Klein returns home and states to his brother that the best chance of survival is to go to the center of town, which is one of the higher points on the island. But Isaac disagrees, saying that their house is stormproof, and try as he might, Joseph could not change his brother's mind. At 6:15, the winds shift direction and start coming from the west, signaling that the eye of the storm has arrived. Houses near the beach begin to fall first. Debris is flying everywhere in the 120-140 mile per hour wind. The rain was pouring down so heavily that people could barely see, but the worst is yet to come. Around 6:30, the water flooding into the city rises 4 feet in 4 seconds. Galveston Island is completely engulfed in water, and then the true horror happens. House after house after house begin to collapse, and people are thrown into the water. Wind is rushing by at 140 miles per hour. Rain is pummeling upon the people. Slate tiles from roofs and debris are crashing around, taking people with them, and no one can see. People try to scramble onto pieces of floating furniture in an attempt to survive. Strangled voices pierce the howling of the storm as people cry for help. Help that would never come. Pure fear, more than they have ever experienced before, was filtering into their veins. The only thought that passed through their minds was that there would be no tomorrow. They would die. Thousands of people lay out in the middle of the ferocious water, scared to death. But the wind and rain and the gigantic waves and debris is much too much. So with salt water filling up their lungs, gasping and screaming, one by one the residents drop, never to breathe peacefully again. The powerful waves beat at everything in their paths. They take down a section of streetcar tracks, and colossal steel girders are sent flying in every direction. One of them begins to barrel straight towards Isaac Klein's house. Isaac Klein had done everything he could when building his house to make it stormproof, and as far as we know it might have been stormproof. But one variable he didn't consider was debris, especially giant pieces of steel. His house didn't stand a chance. Both Klein brothers saw it coming. Joseph grabbed the nearest children, and he jumped out the window, right before the steel girder rammed into the house. Joseph Klein and the 2 children, who turned out to be his oldest nieces, climbed on top of a piece of furniture, holding on for dear life. They later pulled Isaac and his youngest daughter on the raft with them. Swirling around in the storm, the Klein brothers and Isaac's 3 children were tossed around, avoiding flying debris as they searched for Cora May, Isaac's wife, but she was nowhere to be found. For hours people were whisked around in the sloshing waves, waiting for the horror to end. When finally, a little after midnight, the storm begins to die down, and around 3 a.m., the water begins to recede. Sunday morning arrives, and it's like the people had woken up on a new planet. All water was gone, and the sun was shining. Survivors began to gather to sing and pray to God, but the storm was only the beginning. Looking around, the city had been demolished. Wood, metal, and other debris lay everywhere. Thousands of houses and buildings are in ruins. 3,600 buildings were destroyed, about 3,000 homes, and two-thirds of the city lay in piles of debris. Thousands and thousands and thousands of corpses lay corrupted around the entire area of the island. Among some of the dead are Isaac Klein's wife Cora May and a Baptist preacher's wife and 6-year-old son, his only family. An orphanage that contained 93 orphans and 10 sisters. All of them had died, except for 3 orphans. The exact number of how many people died will never be known, but it is estimated that between 6,000 to 8,000 people in the city of Galveston had died. 1/6 of the population was gone. In total, between 10,000 to 12,000 people on the entire island were found dead, and a grim odor was swirling around the city, reminding them of their dead. The once booming and prosperous port city of Galveston was now a devastated wasteland. The survivors began to search the city looking for corpses, and they brought them to the center of town to be laid out in rows to be identified. While people scoured the city, they could hear people buried under debris crying for help. Some were able to be rescued, but others were buried so deep that there was no way to get them, so the trapped people had to cry themselves to death. Once all of the corpses that they could find were lying in piles on the ground, it was decided that they would load the bodies up on a boat and dump the thousands and thousands of people in the ocean. But soon after, the tide had swept all the bodies back onto the island. There was only one option left, so the corpses were burned. Hundreds of piles lay throughout the island, with smoke rising high into the air. The sight and smell of it all was something the survivors would never forget. Word had spread about the tragedy back on the mainland, and money was raised and given to the Red Cross to send to Galveston. People came to help Galveston clean up and rebuild, while some others had lost hope and headed for a new life on the mainland. As a result of the hurricane, a 6-mile-long seawall was built, and sand was pumped from the Gulf to elevate the island by 17 feet. The citizens all got together and developed the commission form of city government, now used by many other cities, which is when voters elect 5 to 7 members who act as leaders of the city. The hurricane of 1900, or the Galveston Hurricane, taught Americans that nothing lasts forever and nothing is impossible, to not be overconfident, and that there is so much in the world that we will never know. Today that hurricane is remembered as being the deadliest natural disaster in American history. So every year on its anniversary, we remember the thousands of people who never woke up to see that sunny Sunday morning of despair. Galveston never quite recovered from the hurricane to what it used to be, because up north near Houston, oil was discovered. So Galveston slowly faded away, remembered as once upon a time a hopeful and promising city, but whose dreams had been shattered by the will of the sea.